"You're not part of this company anymore, Evelyn," Brandon Carter said, sliding the termination papers across the polished conference table like the decision had already been made, like it had always been his to make, and for a moment no one in the room spoke, not because they agreed with him, but because they were waiting to see what she would do next. The boardroom sat 30 floors above downtown Chicago, all glass walls and muted light. The skyline stretched out behind them in clean gray lines, and the quiet hum of the HVAC system filled the space between breaths as 12 executives shifted in their leather chairs, avoiding eye contact, pretending to study the documents in front of them while Brandon leaned back with one arm draped over his chair, relaxed, confident, certain. Evelyn Carter didn't reach for the papers, she didn't even look at them, she just rested her hands lightly on the table, fingers still, posture straight, her expression calm in a way that made it difficult to read whether she had heard him at all, and that silence stretched just long enough to make someone at the far end of the table clear their throat. Brandon smiled faintly, mistaking her stillness for hesitation for weakness. "Let's not make this uncomfortable," he added, his tone light but edged. "The board has already reviewed everything, this is just a formality." And a few of the newer members nodded too quickly, as if agreement would keep them on the right side of whatever was happening, while others stayed quiet, watching, measuring. Evelyn's gaze moved once slowly from Brandon to the papers and then back to him, not angry, not surprised, just observant, as if she were taking note of a detail that would matter later. And in that moment the room felt smaller, tighter, like something unseen had just shifted. Brandon tapped the top page with his finger. "You'll find the terms generous," he said. "Severance, transition support, everything you need." The words polished, rehearsed, and just beneath them something sharper, something personal, and someone near the window let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh before catching themselves. Evelyn didn't react to that either, she simply leaned back a fraction of an inch, the movement controlled, deliberate, her eyes steady on Brandon's face, and for the first time his smile flickered, just slightly, like he wasn't entirely sure why she wasn't playing her part, why she wasn't arguing, defending, demanding explanations. Outside, a siren passed far below, faint through the glass, and the late afternoon light shifted across the table, catching the edge of the documents he had pushed toward her, bright white against the dark wood, official, final, or at least that was how it was meant to look. Brandon straightened a little, filling the silence again. "You built something valuable here," he said, almost generous now. "But it's time to move on." And there it was, the assumption laid bare, that the company was his to manage, his to define, his to take forward without her, that whatever she had been before could be reduced to a past contribution, a line item, a phase that had ended. Evelyn let that sit between them for a second, then another, and then she finally moved, not toward the papers but toward him, just enough to close the distance of attention. Her voice, when it came, quiet, even almost conversational. "If you're done," she said, "then finish it properly." And she slid the folder an inch closer to him without opening it, without reading a single word, a small motion that shifted the weight of the moment back across the table. And for the first time since he had spoken, Brandon hesitated just for a second, because something in the way she said it didn't sound like surrender, it sounded like permission, and he didn't understand yet what he had just been allowed to do. Brandon's fingers rested on the edge of the folder for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before he pulled it back toward himself, the hesitation small enough that most people in the room would not have noticed, but it was there, a brief interruption in the confidence he had been carrying since he walked in. He cleared his throat and gave a short nod, as if reaffirming his own authority, then flipped the folder open with deliberate care, the paper making a soft, crisp sound that seemed louder than it should have in the quiet room. And as he scanned the first page, his expression remained composed, controlled, the same polished certainty he had worn all afternoon. Across the table, Evelyn did not move, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting lightly against the surface, her gaze steady not on the documents but on him, watching, measuring, the way someone watches a process they already understand. One of the senior board members, a man named Harold Whitman, who had been with the company longer than Brandon had been alive, shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes flicking between them before settling on the papers in front of him, his jaw tightening just enough to suggest he was holding back a comment he had decided not to make. Brandon turned a page, then another, his movements smooth but just a touch slower than before, and then he reached the final sheet, the one that carried the formal language of termination, the signatures already printed neatly at the bottom except for the space reserved for his own, and he picked up the pen that had been set beside the folder, a heavy silver pen that reflected the overhead lights in a thin line across its surface. He did not look up as he spoke. "This is straightforward," he said, his tone even. "Once this is signed, the transition will begin immediately." And there was something in the way he said immediately that carried an edge, a quiet assertion that he was in control of the timeline, of the outcome, of the room itself. No one responded, the silence holding steady, and somewhere near the window a chair creaked softly as someone adjusted their position. The sound brief but noticeable in the stillness. Brandon lowered the pen to the paper, the tip hovering for just a moment as if he were considering something. Then he signed his name in a clean, practiced motion, the ink settling into the page with a finality that he seemed to take satisfaction in. And when he finished, he placed the pen down with a soft click and pushed the folder back across the table toward Evelyn, his expression returning to that same faint, confident smile. "It is done," he said, leaning back again, his arm draping over the back of his chair, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested closure, as if the matter had been resolved, as if there was nothing left to discuss. Evelyn glanced down at the folder for the first time, not opening it, just letting her eyes rest on the top page for a second before lifting them again to meet his. And there was no anger there, no visible reaction at all, just a calm, steady awareness that made the room feel even quieter. At the far end of the table, Daniel Brooks, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, finally moved, the subtle shift of his chair drawing a few glances in his direction, and he placed both hands on the table as he stood, the movement unhurried, precise, like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Brandon's attention flicked toward him, a slight narrowing of his eyes as if he were trying to place the relevance of a man who had not spoken until now, and for a brief second, the confidence in his posture tightened, just enough to be felt even if it could not be easily seen. Daniel adjusted his jacket, his gaze moving once to Evelyn and then back to Brandon, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying easily across the table without needing to rise. "Mr. Carter," he said, "before we proceed any further, there is a matter of authority that needs to be clarified." And the words settled into the room with a weight that shifted the balance of the moment, subtle but unmistakable, like the first sign of something changing beneath the surface. Brandon let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, dismissive, confident. "There is nothing unclear," he replied, his tone sharpening slightly. "The board has agreed, the documents are signed." But even as he said it, a few of the board members avoided his gaze, their attention drifting toward Daniel instead, toward the quiet certainty in the way he stood there. And Evelyn remained exactly where she was, watching, saying nothing, her silence no longer empty but deliberate, as if everything that needed to happen next was already in motion, and she was simply allowing it to unfold. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, the kind of shift that did not announce itself but made every small sound feel sharper, more defined, and Brandon felt it before he understood it. The way the air changes just before a storm, subtle, almost dismissible, but there. Daniel Brooks did not raise his voice, did not step forward dramatically. He simply reached into the leather portfolio he had carried into the room and placed a thin stack of documents on the table with precise care, aligning the edges as if the exact position mattered. And for a moment no one reached for them, not because they were unimportant, but because everyone understood they were about to be. Brandon exhaled through his nose, a short controlled breath, and leaned forward again, his earlier relaxed posture tightening just slightly as his eyes moved to the documents. "If you have something to say, say it," he said, the impatience now clearer in his tone, less polished, more exposed, and Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the invitation without rushing to fill it. "Authority is not established by assumption," he said calmly. "It is established by structure." And that word seemed to land differently in the room, drawing the attention of those who understood its weight. Evelyn remained still, her gaze lowering briefly to the new documents and then lifting again, her expression unchanged, as if she had already read every word that was about to be revealed. Daniel slid the top page forward, turning it just enough so that it faced Brandon directly. And the motion was simple, controlled, but it redirected the center of the room, shifting it away from Brandon's signed papers and toward something else entirely. Brandon's eyes dropped to the page, scanning quickly at first, then slowing, his focus tightening as the lines of text began to register. And for the first time since the meeting had begun, the confidence in his face did not return immediately. It paused, recalibrated, as if the information in front of him did not match the version of reality he had been operating under. One of the board members leaned slightly closer, trying not to appear obvious, while another adjusted their glasses, both drawn in by the same quiet pull of uncertainty that had begun to spread across the table. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the edge of the document, not covering anything, just anchoring it in place. Carter Holdings was restructured 11 years ago, he continued, his voice even, almost conversational, following a period of financial instability that required immediate intervention, and a few heads turned subtly toward Evelyn, then back to the paper, connecting pieces that had never been fully explained. Brandon's jaw set, his eyes moving line by line. Now no longer skimming, his hand shifting slightly on the table as if grounding himself. I am aware of the company's history, he said, though the words sounded less certain than they had a minute earlier, and Daniel inclined his head just slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. Then you are also aware, he said, that the restructuring included the formation of a private trust, and that was the point where the room went completely still, not the polite stillness from before, but a deeper silence, one that carried attention instead of avoidance. Brandon's eyes flicked up for a brief second, meeting Daniel's, then back down to the page, and something in that quick movement betrayed a crack, small but real, in the control he had been projecting. Evelyn did not move, did not speak, but her presence in the room felt different now, less like someone being addressed and more like someone being revealed, and the difference was subtle but unmistakable. Daniel continued without pause. The trust holds a controlling interest in the company, he said, and he let that sentence settle for just a fraction longer than the others, allowing the implication to surface on its own rather than forcing it. And across the table, Harold Whitman leaned back slowly, the faintest hint of recognition crossing his face as if a detail he had known but not considered in years had just come back into focus. Brandon's grip on the edge of the table tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes returning to the signature line on his own document, then back to the one in front of him, and for the first time the two did not align, the authority he had just exercised no longer sitting cleanly within the structure that Daniel was laying out piece by piece. That trust, Daniel said quietly, his gaze steady, is not governed by the board. And the words did not need emphasis, they carried their own, and as they settled into the room, the balance shifted again, more clearly this time, away from assumption and toward something far more defined, something Brandon had not accounted for, not fully, not correctly, and Evelyn, still silent, watched it happen without a single change in her expression. Brandon did not speak right away, and that silence was different from Evelyn's. His was not controlled, not intentional. It was the kind that comes when a thought does not land where it was supposed to, when the next sentence you plan no longer fits the moment you are standing in. His eyes moved again across the document, slower now, tracing lines he should have recognized before, details that had been present all along but had never mattered to him until now, and his jaw tightened just enough that the change was visible to the people closest to him. That does not change anything, he said finally, but the words came a fraction too late, a fraction too forced, and even he seemed to hear it as he said it. Daniel did not interrupt, did not correct him immediately. He simply let the statement settle into the room, allowed the contrast between confidence and uncertainty to exist for a second longer. Then he reached forward and turned one page with a quiet, deliberate motion. It changes everything, he replied, not louder, not sharper, just clearer, and that clarity drew every eye back to him. Across the table, one of the board members leaned forward fully now, no longer pretending to disengage, his attention fixed on the page Daniel had revealed, while another shifted their chair closer to the table, the subtle movement of interest spreading from one end of the room to the other. Evelyn remained still, her posture unchanged, her hands resting exactly where they had been, but now the stillness carried weight. It held the room in place rather than disappearing into it, and the difference was unmistakable. Brandon glanced up again, this time not at Daniel, but at Evelyn, as if searching for some reaction, some confirmation, something that would make the situation align with the version he had believed in. But she offered nothing, no expression, no signal, just the same steady presence, and that absence of reaction seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. Daniel continued, his voice measured, each word placed with care. The trust agreement specifies that all executive authority is retained by the primary beneficiary unless explicitly transferred. And he paused just long enough for the words to be understood, not rushed past, not softened. No such transfer has occurred, he added, and this time he did not need to wait. The implication moved through the room on its own. Brandon's hand shifted on the table again, his fingers curling slightly as if he were trying to anchor himself to something solid. The board approved this action, he said, but now he was looking not at Daniel, not at Evelyn, but at the other members around the table, searching for reinforcement, for agreement, for the structure he had relied on to hold its shape, and what he found instead was hesitation, small but visible, a few glances exchanged, a few eyes lowered, a few shoulders stiffening as the certainty they had assumed began to fracture. Harold Whitman cleared his throat quietly, not to interrupt, but because the silence had grown too heavy to ignore, and when he spoke, his voice was slower than before, more careful. "We were not presented with this information," he said, not accusing, not defensive, just stating a fact that now seemed to matter more than anything else in the room. Brandon turned toward him quickly, the movement sharper than anything he had done so far. "It was not relevant," he replied, but the response came too quickly, too absolute, and it did not settle the way he intended it to. Daniel did not argue with him. He simply reached for another page and slid it forward, aligning it with the others, the motion precise, almost quiet enough to be missed if not for the tension that now filled every corner of the room. "It is relevant," he said, "because the primary beneficiary retains controlling interest and decision-making authority." And then for the first time, he allowed his gaze to shift directly to Evelyn, not for confirmation, but as acknowledgement, as if the structure he was describing had always been centered on her whether the room had recognized it or not. Brandon followed that glance instinctively, his eyes landing on Evelyn again, and this time the look he gave her was different, no longer dismissive, no longer confident, but searching, trying to reconcile the quiet woman sitting across from him with the authority being described in terms that left very little room for interpretation. Evelyn met his gaze without changing her expression, without leaning forward or back, without offering anything beyond the same calm stillness she had held from the beginning, and in that moment, it became clear that nothing about her had changed, only the room's understanding of her had, and that realization settled over the table with a quiet finality that no one spoke against. Brandon did not sit back this time. He stayed leaning forward with both hands on the table as if proximity could restore control, as if being closer to the documents would somehow make them change, and his eyes moved again between the pages Daniel had laid out and the signatures he had just placed with such certainty only minutes earlier, the contrast now impossible to ignore. "You are saying," he began, his voice slower now, measured in a way it had not been before, "that the board has no authority over executive decisions," and he directed the question toward Daniel, but his gaze flickered briefly toward the others, searching again for alignment, for agreement, for something stable. Daniel did not rush to answer. He let the question settle, then replied in the same calm tone. "I am saying that authority exists within defined limits," he said, "and those limits were established in the restructuring documents that govern this company to this day." And as he spoke, he slid one more page forward, this one bearing a set of signatures older than the ones Brandon had just written, dated, formal, anchored in a time before the current leadership had assumed anything about how power was distributed. Across the table, Harold Whitman leaned in further, his attention now fully engaged, and another board member adjusted the folder in front of them, finally turning pages they had previously ignored, the quiet shift of paper echoing faintly in the room. Brandon exhaled again, this time more audibly, and for a moment he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the signature line at the bottom of the document Daniel had presented, the name there clear, unmistakable, and older than his own authority within the company. He looked up directly at Evelyn now, holding her gaze longer than before, as if trying to find some indication that this was a misunderstanding, some signal that the structure being described was exaggerated or outdated. But she gave him nothing, not resistance, not confirmation, just the same composed stillness that had been there from the beginning. "This is outdated," he said finally, though the statement lacked the firmness it would have carried earlier. "The company has evolved since then," and he gestured slightly toward the room, toward the people, toward the version of control he believed existed in the present. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the point without conceding it. "Operations evolve," he said. "Structure does not unless it is formally amended." And he let the word formally carry its weight, its implication clear without needing to be emphasized. "There has been no amendment to the controlling interest," he added, and as the sentence settled, quiet recognition moved through the board, subtle but visible in the way shoulders shifted, in the way eyes moved from one document to another, connecting timelines that had not been considered together before. Brandon's hand tightened slightly against the table again, and this time he did not try to hide it. "You are implying that she retains full authority," he said, the word she landing differently now, no longer dismissive, but edged with something closer to uncertainty. And Daniel did not look at him when he answered. He looked at the documents, at the structure itself. "I am stating that the authority was never transferred," he said, and then after a brief pause he added, "which means it was never yours to exercise in this manner." And that was the moment the room shifted completely, not subtly, not gradually, but definitively, the kind of shift that does not reverse once it happens. Brandon leaned back slightly, not in relaxation but in recalibration, his posture adjusting as if he were reassessing the ground beneath him, and his eyes moved again across the table, but this time the search for agreement was different. It was no longer about support, it was about confirmation of something he had not anticipated. Harold Whitman spoke again, quieter than before but with more certainty. "We should have reviewed this before proceeding," he said, and the statement was not directed at anyone in particular, but it landed in a way that made its meaning clear. Evelyn finally moved, just a small shift of her hand as she reached toward the folder that still sat unopened in front of her, and the movement drew every eye back to her instantly, the room settling into a new kind of silence, one that waited rather than avoided. She did not open the folder right away. She simply placed her hand on top of it, steady, controlled, and looked across the table at Brandon, her expression unchanged, her voice when she spoke quiet and even. "You should have read everything before you signed," she said, and the words were not sharp, not raised, but they carried more weight than anything that had been said so far, because they did not argue, they did not defend, they simply stated a fact that could no longer be undone, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, Brandon did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left in the moment that fit the version of control he had started with, and he was beginning to understand that too late. The silence that followed Evelyn's last sentence did not feel empty, it felt structured, as if the room itself had been reorganized around a truth that no one had fully acknowledged until that moment, and Brandon remained still, his eyes fixed on her hand resting on the folder, as though that small physical contact was now the only stable point in the room. Daniel Brooks did not move either. He simply waited, allowing the weight of the situation to settle without rushing it, and then he spoke again, his tone unchanged, calm and precise. "For clarity," he said, "the trust that governs controlling interest in Carter Holdings was established under irrevocable terms, and those terms designate Evelyn Carter as the sole decision authority in matters of executive appointment and removal." And as those words were spoken, a subtle shift moved across the board members, not dramatic, not loud, but visible in the way eyes lowered to documents again, this time reading with intent rather than assumption. Brandon finally looked down at the papers fully, no longer scanning for convenience but reading line by line, and for the first time his expression did not hold confidence, it held processing, as if the structure he had been operating within was no longer aligning with what he was seeing. "That is not how this has been functioning," he said, but the statement lacked force, and even he seemed to recognize it as it left his mouth, because function and authority were not the same thing, and the distinction was now unavoidable. Harold Whitman spoke again, slower this time, his voice carrying a tone of careful reconsideration. "We have been operating under board delegation," he said, almost to himself, "not ownership authority." And that distinction hung in the air long enough for several members to stop moving entirely. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without needing to reinforce it. "Delegation does not override ownership structure," he said, and then he placed one final document on top of the stack, a clean certified record, the kind that did not require interpretation, only recognition. Brandon looked at it, and for a brief second he did not speak, his hand hovering near the edge of the table before pulling back slightly, as if he was reconsidering even physical engagement with what was in front of him. And when he finally looked up, it was not at Daniel, it was at Evelyn. She met his gaze without change, without reaction, without any visible shift in emotion, and that absence of performance was now louder than anything else in the room. "You allowed this to continue," Brandon said, but the accusation lacked direction, and it was not clear whether it was aimed at Daniel, at the board, or at the structure itself, and Evelyn finally responded, her voice even and quiet. "No," she said simply, and that single word carried more finality than any explanation would have. The room did not move after that, and even the air seemed to slow as the implication settled fully. Because if it had not been allowed, then it had only been assumed, and assumption had no weight against documentation. Daniel adjusted the final page slightly, aligning it with the others. Effective immediately, he said. Any executive action taken without authorization from the controlling authority is considered outside governance protocol. And the phrasing was not emotional, it was procedural, but its effect was immediate. Brandon's posture shifted again, not collapsing, not breaking, but recalibrating into something quieter, less certain. And for the first time since he had entered the room, he did not attempt to assert control verbally. Evelyn finally opened the folder in front of her, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge it, and inside were documents that no one else needed to speak about for their meaning to be understood. And as she looked down at them, the room waited, no longer for explanation but for direction, because whatever had just ended or begun was no longer in question, only in motion. The room did not change its physical shape, but its meaning had already shifted completely, and now every person inside it was aware of that shift even if they had not yet decided how to respond to it. And Evelyn Carter remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes moving across the documents inside the folder with a calm precision that did not suggest surprise or discovery, but confirmation, as if she had been expecting this exact moment to arrive long before anyone else in the room understood. It was possible. Brandon stood near the table edge now, no longer leaning forward, no longer performing control, his posture adjusted into something more restrained, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he looked between Evelyn and Daniel, trying to reconstruct a sequence of events that no longer supported the version he had walked into the room believing. Daniel Brooks closed the portfolio in front of him with a soft motion, signaling that his part of the explanation was complete, and he stepped back slightly, allowing space to form naturally around Evelyn rather than filling it himself, and that absence of explanation created a different kind of attention in the room, one that turned toward her without being directed. Evelyn finally closed the folder in front of her and placed both hands on top of it, not pressing down, not emphasizing force, just resting there as if the matter beneath her hands was already settled. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise to meet the tension in the room, it moved underneath it, steady and controlled. "This meeting is concluded in its current form," she said, and the words were not dramatic, but they were absolute. And the board members reacted not with noise but with subtle movement. Chairs shifting slightly, documents being gathered more carefully, eyes lowering in acknowledgement rather than resistance. Brandon's expression tightened, not into anger, but into focus, as if he was trying to find a procedural opening, a gap in language or structure that would allow him to reassert position. "Evelyn," he began, but she did not allow the hesitation to grow into an argument. She turned her gaze toward him directly, and the room followed that shift immediately. "There is no interpretation required," she said calmly. "The authority structure has been defined and confirmed," and she paused only long enough for the statement to settle before continuing. "Any action taken outside of that structure is not recognized within this governance framework." And the phrasing was precise, almost clinical, removing emotion from the conclusion entirely. Brandon opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, the instinct to respond still present but no longer supported by certainty, and for the first time he looked around the table not as someone expecting agreement, but as someone checking for consequences. Harold Whitman lowered his gaze to the documents in front of him, then slowly closed the folder he had been reviewing, a quiet acknowledgement that the meeting had moved beyond its original purpose, and one by one others followed, not in agreement with Brandon, but in recognition of the shift that had already occurred. Daniel remained silent now, watching Evelyn instead of the room, as if confirming that no further clarification was required from him. Evelyn stood slowly, not abruptly, and when she rose, the action did not feel like escalation. It felt like resolution. And she adjusted the edge of the folder in front of her before looking across the table once more. Brandon did not sit down, but he also did not advance. He remained where he was, suspended between what he had assumed and what was now established, and Evelyn's voice softened slightly, not in weakness but in finality. "You were not removed from anything you had authority over," she said, "because you never held it." And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any argument that had preceded it. She turned slightly toward Daniel, giving a small nod that did not require interpretation, then back toward the room where no one spoke, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was procedural, as if the next steps had already been determined by structure rather than emotion. And as Evelyn gathered her folder and prepared to leave the table, The boardroom did not resist her movement, it adjusted around it, because at that moment everyone understood that nothing in the room had changed except their understanding of who had been in control all along. The atmosphere in the boardroom did not return to what it had been before the meeting began, because what had existed before no longer had a valid structure to return to, and instead everything now operated under a different understanding that had quietly replaced it without resistance. And Evelyn Carter stood near the head of the table holding her folder with a steady grip, not as someone concluding a confrontation, but as someone closing a procedural phase that had already been resolved at a level deeper than conversation. Brandon remained near his chair, not seated, not advancing, his posture now stripped of its earlier confidence, replaced with a controlled stillness that looked more like containment than authority, and his eyes followed Evelyn as she moved toward the exit side of the room, as if tracking a decision he no longer had influence over. Daniel Brooks stepped slightly aside, creating a clear path for her movement, and that small gesture reinforced something that no longer needed to be stated, because the room had already adjusted itself around the shift in hierarchy. One of the board members reached for a document, then stopped midway, as if reconsidering whether any further action from them carried relevance at this stage, and the hesitation was mirrored subtly across the table, not in panic but in recalibration. Evelyn paused briefly before the glass doors at the far end of the room, not turning back immediately, and when she did, it was not to address the board as a whole, but to acknowledge the structure that had just been exposed, her voice steady and small but signaled alignment with closure rather than continuation, and one by one others followed, not out of agreement with Brandon, but out of recognition that the authority defining the room had already changed hands in a way that did not require further validation. Brandon's gaze moved once more across the table, slower now, as if searching for a final point of stability, but what he found instead was absence of support, not in hostility, but in disengagement, and that distinction was more decisive than confrontation. Evelyn finally faced the room fully for the last time, her expression unchanged, her posture composed, and when she spoke again it was not to extend the moment but to finalize it. This board will receive formal restructuring documentation within 48 hours, she said, and all interim decisions will be reviewed under the controlling trust authority. And there was no reaction needed to that statement because it did not invite interpretation. She then turned toward the exit, and this time she moved without stopping, her steps measured, unhurried, and the room did not follow her physically, but it followed her movement in silence, as if acknowledging that the center of decision-making had already left the table. Daniel collected his documents and moved after her, not hurried, not trailing, but aligned with the same direction, and as they reached the doors, the glass reflected the boardroom behind them, where Brandon still stood, now alone in his original position, no longer surrounded by agreement or assumption, only by the realization that the structure he had attempted to command had never been under his control. Outside the room, the corridor lighting was softer, more neutral, and Evelyn walked forward without looking back again, her folder held at her side, her pace unchanged, and the sound of the boardroom door closing behind them marked not an end of conflict, but the final confirmation of authority that had been present long before anyone else recognized it. The corridor outside the boardroom was quiet in a way that felt heavier than noise, the kind of silence that followed a decision already made rather than one still being discussed, and Evelyn Carter walked through it at a steady pace with Daniel Brooks a few steps behind her, not rushing, not speaking, simply matching the direction she had already set as if no further instruction was needed. The glass doors behind them closed softly, but the sound carried enough weight to mark the separation between what had just ended inside and what now existed outside it. Evelyn did not stop walking until they reached the end of the hallway where the executive elevators stood, and only then did she slow, pressing the button once without hesitation. Daniel adjusted the folder in his hand, then spoke quietly for the first time since leaving the room. "The formal notice will be distributed within the hour," he said, not as a question, but as confirmation of process, and Evelyn nodded once without turning toward him, her attention still forward, still settled. Behind them, through the glass panels of the corridor, the boardroom was visible as muted silhouettes, moving slowly now, no longer coordinated, no longer certain, and at the center of it Brandon Carter remained standing alone near the table, no longer addressing anyone, no longer receiving acknowledgement, his posture unchanged but his authority no longer reflected in the room around him. Inside that space, no one followed him as he spoke again, and even his voice, though present, no longer carried the structure it once had. In the corridor, the elevator arrived with a soft chime and the doors opened to reveal an empty interior, clean and still, and Evelyn stepped inside first, followed by Daniel. The doors closed without delay, and for a moment neither of them spoke as the elevator began its descent, the quiet hum replacing the controlled silence of the boardroom above. Daniel glanced once at the digital display showing the floors decreasing, then at Evelyn and said, "There will be procedural resistance, not as warning, but as acknowledgement of standard transition behavior." And Evelyn replied without looking at him, "It will resolve within established governance boundaries," her tone unchanged, steady, as if the outcome had already been accounted for long before the meeting had taken place. The elevator continued downward, and with each floor passing, the tension that had filled the room above felt increasingly distant, not because it had disappeared, but because it had already been contained within structure. When the doors opened at the ground-level lobby, the atmosphere shifted again, becoming wider, more open, the sound of the city outside filtering in through the glass entrance, distant traffic footsteps, and the low rhythm of a normal workday continuing unaffected. Evelyn stepped out first, pausing briefly near the reception area where employees moved with routine focus, unaware of the change that had just occurred above them, and for a moment she observed the space not as disruption, but as continuity, as if everything still functioned within its expected design. Daniel followed, closing the distance slightly, and asked quietly, "Do you want immediate executive transition initiated at operational level?" And Evelyn paused only long enough to consider the phrasing before responding. "Initiate standard transition protocol," she said, and continued walking. There was no celebration, no emphasis, only motion that reflected completion rather than victory. Behind them, through the glass walls of the building lobby, the upper floors remained visible, unchanged in appearance, but now altered in meaning, because what had been assumed as authority no longer held without verification. Upstairs, Brandon finally sat down again at the boardroom table, not because the meeting continued, but because there was nothing left to stand for, and around him the remaining board members gathered their materials in silence, no longer aligning with him, no longer waiting for instruction, simply adjusting to a structure that had already redefined itself without permission or resistance. Evelyn exited the building without looking back, stepping into the late afternoon air where the city moved at its usual pace, unchanged, and Daniel followed beside her, the distance between them consistent, the conversation complete, and as they walked forward into the open street, the weight of what had occurred remained behind them, not as chaos, but as order finally restored to its correct source.